This begins CD number 5.
Somebody writes what I think is an excellent question. Since you described hearing and seeing regarding a lot of the same examples of sounds, shapes, colors, tastes, can you distinguish the hearing from the seeing? What is the principal distinction articulated by the ulama?
I've never myself encountered any explanation of how that would be different other than to say that it was. How about you?
Well, yeah, my understanding is that these are sam'iyya attributes, unlike the other ones which are rational attributes. In other words, we believe about those other attributes that they can actually, the intellect, free of revelation, can arrive at the same understanding. But hearing, sight, and speech are attributes that could not be arrived at through rational thought, that they're arrived at through revelation. And our understanding is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنِّنِي أَنَا مَعَكُمَا أَسْمَعُ وَأَرَى, I'm with you and I hear and I see. And the fact that He's using two words that are different, it indicates that these are two different functions. And they're both related, obviously, to knowledge and awareness. So they're extensions of the attribute of ilm, which is to have ihata of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. And you get into idrak, what's called idrak, and this is a khilaf amongst the theologians of whether or not that is an attribute. Allah obviously knows what taste is because He created taste. And He gave us sweet and bitter. And Allah did that. That's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He knows what humor is because He created us a risible animal. So we have a Lord that understands things like irony. These are things that Allah has put into us. And that's why comedians have to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that people can get their jokes.
I'm just trying to get these questions organized because they're wonderful questions. Many of them that I think have already been answered, I've eliminated. If they're going to be answered in an upcoming session, I've also eliminated. And I was trying to organize them into some meaningful categories. A couple of questions have come in about paradoxes. So I was hoping either Imam Hamza or Dr. Umar could just comment on common atheist arguments such as, can God create a stone so heavy He Himself cannot lift it? And can you just answer that conundrum?
Well, I think it was Augustine who answered that he could, but he's busy preparing hell for people that ask questions like that.
Allahu Akbar. For the record, the person who wrote the question did not ask it. They said, "How do I respond?"
No, but these are common. These are common things that you get in philosophy classes, and you do see them in books, and they are brought up. This goes under what yastahilu lillah, which means it's inconceivable. We don't say it's impossible. We say it's inconceivable. We do not conceive of a creator. The intellect rejects that. Now, obviously, within traditional theology, the problem, and this is a problem that's brought up in Greek thought as well. The problem is, did God create logic and the rules of logic, or is He Himself also subject to the rules of logic? It's the same as, are things good in and of themselves, or are they good because Allah commands to them? These are philosophical bugbears that people that spend their time thinking about these things have. But we would just say simply that هَذِي يَسْتَحِيلُ لِلَّهِ, it's not conceivable that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would do that. And Ibn Hazm has some really interesting things to say about the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the things that are possible and yet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not do. Ta'ala Allah, like Allah is transcendent or exalted beyond that. But we do have just a recognition that we would say هَذَا يَسْتَحِيلُ لِلَّهِ, it's inconceivable that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would do that. And the fact that He has created human beings with a capacity to think of things like that is in a sense really a proof also of His existence. One of the things that Sidi Ahmed Zarruq said, that he felt that one of the greatest proofs of God were sailors. He said you'll find the worst human beings on the planet amongst sailors. And he said, and yet, this merciful God allows them to do all these horrible things in these port cities and get on these ships and cross vast oceans without destroying them.
Several questions have rolled in about, I think that there tends to be a segment of the audience that might be a little bit overwhelmed with the level of detail and the specificity of these different attributes and the particularity with which each one needs to be understood. And there seems to be a concern of to what extent are Muslims really responsible to know all this material, and if they just feel like they can't handle it or it's beyond them, what is a basic minimal level that they should feel comfortable with?
I think what's really important is that, as Imam Hamza said, that the theology that we have is a very sophisticated one that has been worked on with great diligence, and in all the Abrahamic faiths it stands out as one of the most coherent and comprehensive theologies of all. Although in Islamic civilization our preoccupation was not theology, it was sacred law and Sufism. These were the two areas that produced a huge volume of civilized production. Yet theology is always at the basis of that. Therefore, if you want to understand the classical law, especially legal theory, you have to go through the theology, because that's where the fundamental logic comes from, the terminology, the way of thinking and proof. And also, in many of the traditional theological texts, they will end with ihsan, they will end with perfect service to God. So that now that you know your Lord, come to know Him in practice and approach Him by repentance and by thankfulness and by patience and by fear and hope and love and so forth. So when you go through these 13 attributes, which, as Imam Hamza said, are not arbitrary, and they are a matter of consensus among the majority of Sunni ulama, then you have a very clear picture of your Creator whom you worship. It was often required that people understood these basic attributes. To understand them with great sophistication, that was not regarded to be a requirement, simply because of the fact that it's beyond the capacity of many human beings.
This is not difficult at a very basic level. Those 13 attributes can be learned by any child, matter of minutes, 10, 15 minutes. And a basic understanding of their semantic meaning is not difficult either. We're going into, obviously, fleshing something out. I mean, I wouldn't even say it's fleshing it. It's, just adding on cartilage, really. I mean, we haven't gone into a lot of great detail in relation to what the ulama go into, to be honest with you. And that isn't to make you feel like, I mean, this stuff is pretty overwhelming. I'm overwhelmed by it. I mean, I listen to it and it makes your head spin. I mean, if you think about God, you have to start feeling like you're drowning. And if you don't, something's really wrong with you. I mean, there's nothing deeper than this subject in existence. There's nothing that we can occupy our minds with that is more profound and more vast and more deep than the subject of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's as simple as that. I mean, that's the reality of it. So if you feel overwhelmed, I'm glad. Because I feel overwhelmed. I think Dr. Umar feels overwhelmed. And so don't see it as a negative thing. But don't also feel like I can't learn this, because that's not true either. Aristotle says that the thing that has the most just distribution in the world is intellect. That Allah has been most just in His distribution of intellect than anything else. And the overwhelming majority of human beings share similar intellectual capacities. And that's the truth. And a few are one or two standard deviants away from that norm, but those aren't, those are rare people, and they're necessary on both ends. I'm sure the vast majority of people in here are more than capable of grasping everything that's been said. I really believe that.
Imam Abdullah al-Haddad, who was one of the great teachers and Sufis of the 18th and 19th century, he said that the unbeliever is bewildered by creation, and the believer is bewildered by the Creator. So this knowledge is bewildering, but you have the perfect soul to receive it. You were helped. God prepared you. He created you with a fitrah that is perfect, a fitrah that knows Him directly. And He gave you names to call upon Him. And when you call upon Him by His names, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, Al-Salam, Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, and you think about these, then you know Him. You come to know Him. And that's why there's no knowledge without practice. There's no practice without knowledge. There's no knowledge without practice. And when you get this knowledge, you have to bring it to life. You worship your Creator. You stand up in prayer at night. You mention His beautiful names, Allah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik, Al-Quddus. And He comes close to you with those names. When you call upon Him, His presence is there. It's always there, but in a special way. And you are able to take that imprint. So that's why this knowledge is not for us a theoretical knowledge. It's a practical knowledge. As Imam Hamza said, religion is basically experience. And these are the guidelines so that that experience be correct. One of the great, Ibn Arabi, one of the great Muslims of all times, may his name be rehabilitated and people understand him for what he was. He said that human knowledge, when it uses horizontal causation and relates things to things and other things to other things, and not vertical causation, which roots it all in God, is metaphorical knowledge. It's not true knowledge. And it multiplies and is multiplied and is multiplied again and to infinity, but it's not rooted. And therefore it's not salvific. It doesn't take you to your Lord. It doesn't take you to salvation. It doesn't build civilization. So this knowledge, which as Imam Hamza said, is the most noble knowledge, the knowledge of the necessary being who created us in the world of possible existence. This is the supreme knowledge. And you will see that even in mastering the 13 attributes, you will now be able to relate to everything else that you study. And especially if one goes further into this, into the incredible insights of our scholars, then there is nothing in the world of mathematics or logic or biology or astronomy or quantum physics that you cannot entertain and perhaps someday solve. So this is one of the keys to our civilization. The fact that very few Muslims today know it is an indication of the great tragedy that has afflicted us. And hopefully today, with this coming together of you with such a beautiful intention to discuss this knowledge which is difficult and is bewildering, this shows your belief. The believer is bewildered by his Creator. But in that bewilderment, there are maps to follow. He is the light. He is the guide. And we are capable of this, and this is what makes us the Adamic human beings, the Muhammadan human beings, that makes us the heirs of our beautiful Prophet and the builders of civilization and humanity.
I have a quick one that I think would be very easy in literally 30 seconds. Can you give the Arabic equivalents for these terminologies? Number 1, creed. Number 2, the attributes of God. And number 3, the names of God.
Well, creed is generally Aqeedah. That's generally how, even though this science has several different names, but Aqeedah is generally creed. And then the attributes are sifat, which is the plural of sifa, which comes from wasafa, to describe in Arabic. So it's description or an attribute or a quality. What was the last one?
The names of God.
The names are the asma. Asma'ullah al-husna are the beautiful names of Allah, the asma. And that's also, the highest knowledge of Allah is His names. And these 13 are the foundations of all the names. Like if you understand these attributes, you'll have like qidam is al-awwal, baqa is al-akhir. I mean, everything has the name. The mawjood is al-zahir, wal-batin, that all the names relate to one of these attributes. And also, knowing the names according to our ulama, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah wrote a book on the 10 qualities that will make you beloved to Allah. And one of them was knowing His name. So this is mutara'atul asma, mujarasatul quda, mujanabatul hawa, jawaribun li hubbihi. That knowing His name, sitting with the righteous people, avoiding temptation, these will draw the love of Allah to you. So this is actually one of the ways, and I'm really glad Dr. Umar said that, because I think it's important also to take it outside of just the intellectual aspect of this and recognize that it is ultimately about iman, and it's about a receptivity that's in the hearts and the souls. And the hearts, if they're open, that Allah can, He is al-Fattah. You know, He's the opener and He's the enricher. He is also the teacher. Attaqullah wa yu'allimukum Allah. You know, He is the one that really teaches us. And that's why, you know, I was telling Dr. Omar, my favorite way of teaching is I prefer dialogue, because dialogue allows for a whole lot of things to happen, even though teaching it can happen as well. And I know that my sheikh, one of the things that he taught me is that what the teacher gives is the provision of the students. In other words, just as we have arzaq al-mabani, we have arzaq al-ma'ani. Just as we have provision for our material world, we have provision for our spiritual world. And that's been decreed for you just as your material provision was decreed. And so when you come and you're ready to receive that provision, then the receptivity's there and the meeting's there and everything's, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put all of the conditions that are necessary for that event to take place. And what you might take home today, or what I might take home today, can be restorative of my relationship with Allah. It can actually have a profound impact on me. And I think we should just all be open to that, to be open to the gifts of Al-Wahhab. You know, لا تزيغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Don't lead us astray after you guided us to this truth, and give us from your presence as a gift, your grace, because you are the constant giver of gifts. And so if He yatajalla lana, you know, if He reveals Himself to us as the Wahhab, Allahu Akbar, you know, the gifts just flow, and inshallah we'll all be open to them.
Ameen. Amen to that. I would like to ask a very practical question. A couple of these were sent in concerning children. Somebody writes, how do I explain to my 2 or 3-year-old the concept of God? Or what do I say when she asks me, what is Allah? What analogies might I use? And then on a related note, not exactly on the same point, but related to children, somebody writes, why is it that you think children are just accepting of God? I know it is fitrah, but can you please elaborate? Is it because they haven't reached the age of full intellectual development?
I would say, first of all, children have no taklif at all, none. They learn more from observing you at that age than they learn from anything that you happen to say to them, unless it's said with aggression or something like that. I mean, children are they are much more in their sensory world than they're in the world of meaning. And the ghulam, you know, if you look at the root word of it, it means to lust, which indicates that the infant is in a sensory, they're not in a meaning experience of the world. Doesn't mean that they don't have, there's meanings being imbibed as well, but their dominant mode, because they've come from the realm of meaning, and they have to deal with all this sensory stuff first. So the apparatus for the first 12 years is to actually just learn to be in the world. That's why it's grasping, you know, putting things in their mouth and tasting and touching, and they'll look and do these things. And there's a reason why they're doing all that, because they're literally coming into the world, and you'll see them sometimes they do these amazing, like when they're like 1 or 2, they'll do these funny movements, and you realize they're literally wiring, they're programmed to, it's like when you boot up a computer. They're doing all that booting up. They're getting it all ready. The whole point is it's all preparation for what we've been talking about today. It's to become knowers of God. And that's why He's given them everything. Just let them be who they are. Let them fulfill their divine purpose. And don't get in the way too much. Because they're born already in the fitrah, and it's the parents that mess them up. You know, Muslims have this idea like, إنما كل مولود ولد على الفطرة وإنما أبواه يهودانه أو ينصرانه أو يمجسانه. It's like we don't fall into those three categories. It's not true. Those are archetypes. Muslims do that as well. We turn our children into those archetypes. They might be Muslim, but they'll have those deviations. A lot of Muslims, I think, really misunderstand the meaning of that hadith. Because if you look at the Muslim world now, I mean, I don't see a fitra condition. I really see a lot of very dysfunctional people, and I'm not saying that this society, this is a pretty dysfunctional planet right now, and it has been for some time. And we're dealing with human nature. So that's a problem, because human nature is a constant. You always have the same obstacles in every generation. But many societies, and many of the pure societies that have existed in our history of Bani Adam, people have been very successful at raising and nurturing human beings to become human beings, and we're not as good at it. So I would just say a lot of it is just really letting them just come into their bodies and become human, and they have all the tools, and they need more than anything the examples from the parents. I mean, that's what they need. At a certain age, I mean, my child asked me when he was 6 years old, and I'll never forget this, he said to me, "What's the highest number?" And I said to him, there is no highest number, because any number that you can think of, you could always add 1 to it and make it more. So the next morning, this was a day later, he said to me, "I think you're wrong." And I said, "Well, about what?" And he said, "About the numbers." He said, "There has to be a highest number, but only Allah knows it."
SubhanAllah.
And he was 6 years old, and that's a true story. That is some intuitive knowledge. Many children have intuitive knowledge about reality, and children are very in touch with the unseen world. It's much more real to them because they're not that far away from it, for one. When you see some little children go into these ecstatic states, I mean, I've seen this in many babies, usually before they're 1 year old. They go into these just states of ecstasy, and you just wonder what they're seeing. I mean, Sidi Abdul Aziz Al-Fasi, he said that children can understand the angels, and actually they hear angelic voices and things like that. Allahu Alam, I mean, I haven't seen any hadith or anything, but he was a very righteous man, and that certainly makes sense to me just in my experience, and Allah knows best. So I would just say that children are deeply spiritual, and they're also deeply bestial. I mean, they have a horrible, I mean, this is what we call childish, right? Childish and childlike. I mean, we have 2 words to describe children. Childish is very negative, and childlike is very positive. It's all the beauty of children. It's the innocence. It's the purity. It's all those wonderful things that the Prophet ﷺ, the smell of children, he said that they smelt of paradise. You take a child, and just when they're really young, they have this beautiful smell of just being in that pure state. So all of that is the beauty of but those bestial aspects need to be also dealt with, and that's part of the humanizing process of the selfishness. I, me, mine. This thing, that's mine, and hitting and teaching them about sharing and things like that. And some children, it's unusual, but there are genuinely children that are extremely selfless from early on. They don't have that I, me, mine thing, and they actually don't have that. They share and they do that.
One of the questions was, if your 2 or 3 year old asks you, "What is Allah?"
Yeah.
What is a good answer?
Well, I think basically tell them the truth. He made us. Allah made us. He sees everything we do. He knows everything we do. His presence is here in His knowledge. He's present with us in His knowledge. And if they ask you where He is, we say He invented, He created place. He made place. His awareness is everywhere in His knowledge. He has no fixed place.
Last question I think we should try to get in. This I think is a good one as a high level for the whole conference. In the discussion of aql versus naql, you talked about the juxtaposition historically and methodologically of the two. My question is, which comes first? That is, which should we be grounded in before studying the other? Or is this the classic chicken and the egg dilemma, wherein both are mutually and equally important as foundations for the other? Which do we as students study first, or do we study both simultaneously?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Aql is a condition, a necessary condition for naql. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's absolutely necessary. There are other conditions that go with that. So you have to have intellect first. And that's why أَوَّلُ وَاجِبٍ عَلَى مَنْ كُلِّفَ. And taklif comes with intellect. Before intellect, there's no taklif. So intellect has to precede. The aql precedes naql. The aql also receives naql. It has to be understood. So if I'm speaking to you, you have to understand what I'm saying to you. If I say Allah has neither kathra or adad, and I explain to you that adad is number and kathra is composition, you have to understand the difference between discrete numbers like 3 pens and a pen that has 2 parts, because one is number and the other is composition. So if that's understood by the intellect, if you don't have the ability to understand that, well, you're not teachable. And that's what Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad radiallahu anhu, he said, a man once asked, he was a grammarian, but a man once asked him a question, and he took some time to answer it, and the man said, Afhamtu al-Khalil, I stumped the great Khalil. He looked up, he was in his class, which is a rude thing to say to somebody, but he was in his class, and he just said, Ya hada, what are you talking about? He said, you asked me that question, I was thinking, because these people had firasa. There's people like Imam Shafi'i could look at a person and know whether or not the question that he was asking was a question that Imam Shafi'i's answer would be appropriate for his understanding. And that's why Imam Malik would not answer everybody. And one man once asked him a question and he didn't answer. And the man said, don't you know the hadith, Man katama ilman, al-jamuhu Allahu bidijamin min an-nar, whoever conceals knowledge, Allah will bridle him with a bridle of fire. And Imam Malik said to him, if somebody asked me that question who I felt was a vesicle for the answer, I wouldn't conceal it. In other words, he was saying that hadith is not mutlaq. You don't tell somebody who can't understand what you're talking about, because the Prophet ﷺ said, I was commanded to talk to people to the level of their understanding. And so not every answer or question deserves a full answer. And some, it's better just to avoid the question altogether, depending on the situation and on the audience or on the questioner. And so Al-Khalil, when he was asked that question, he told him there's 4 types of people, there's no 5th. He said people who know and know they know, and those are teachers, learn from them. People who know and don't know they know, and those are people that are like ghafil, he said, heedless of their knowledge, so remind them so that you can benefit from them. Those who don't know and know they don't know, and those are students, so teach them. And then those who don't know and think they know, and those are fools, and avoid them. and that is a problem. Jahal murakkab, which is one of the 6 foundations of kufr, kufri. That is a problem, compounded ignorance. And there's a lot of people out there, and we all suffer at some level from compounded ignorance. I mean, nobody's immune to that. We can misunderstand things and think we've understood them. But when that is your overriding problem, then you have a serious problem.
Imam Hamza, several people wrote in asking what those 6 things are. Do you think you just list them real quick? Or is that impossible?
There's 6. أصول الكفر 6 فاحذرا وخالفهم بعد من بها يتعبد. فأولها ربط عاديا. The first is ربط عاديا, which is to mistake, we call it occasionalism in Western philosophy, is to mistake coincidental occurrences with cause and effect. That's called ربط عاديا. So if you put your hand in fire, you think the fire is what burnt you. That's min usul al-kufri. Because fire didn't burn you. It's Allah who burnt you. But the fire is called a sabab. If you think medicine healed you, it didn't heal you. Allah healed you, but the medicine is a sabab. So rabtu adiyan wa ijabu dhatiyan. Ijabu dhatiyan is to think that the universe created itself. لو حدثت لنفسها الأكوان لاجتمع التساوي والرجحان. If the cosmos brought itself into being, then preponderance and equality would have been joined. In other words, if something doesn't exist, then there's no mukhassis. There's no delimiter or determinant for that thing to exist. And so if it comes into existence by itself, it's impossible, it's inconceivable. So that's ijabu dhatiyan. Ghaflatun, heedlessness, which is the intellect, because of the abilities that the intellect has in its correctness about some things, it assumes that it can understand all things. And this is the problem of the Mu'tazilite. Because people have brilliant intellectual abilities in mathematics, and they think that the intellect, that what can be known through the intellect alone, so they reject the sam'iyat, revelation. And intellect is like a roof. You know, there's a certain point, you just can't go beyond it. And so what the intellect does is it assumes, if I've been in this room all my life, I just assume there's nothing above this roof, because that's all I've ever seen. And somebody comes in and says, no, there's a sky up there. And I said, what are you talking about? There's no sky, it's a roof. No, there's a sky outside, I've seen it. They say, no, I don't believe that. Why? Because I've never seen it. My intellect hasn't perceived it. And so that's a rejection of sama'. وَكَذَلِكَ تَقْلِيدُ, blind adherence, blind imitation, believing something because كَذَلِكَ وَجَدْنَا آبَاءَنَا وَنَحْنُ عَلَى آثَارِهِمْ مُهْرَعُونَ. That we find, that's what we found our fathers doing and we just follow them. That's taqleed, and that is a big problem. وَأَخْذٌ بِظَاهِرِ الْكِتَابِ وَالسُّنَّةِ بِلَا عِلْمٍ مَعَ جَهْلٍ لِتَرْكِيبٍ يُسْنَدُ. Those are the 6 usul al-kufri. The taking from the book and the sunnah, the outward of the book and the sunnah without correct knowledge. And one of the biggest dangers is a lack of knowledge of the Arabic language. Not understanding the subtleties of the Arabic language. And somebody told me, I was asked by this man, he said, you should follow the book and the sunnah, you're teaching all this bid'ah and this and that. And I said, so you want me just to follow the book and the sunnah? He said, yeah. And I said, Quran and hadith. He said, yeah. And I said, and I should just read those? And he said, yeah. And not look at what the ulama. He said, well, it's taqleed. You have to. And I asked him, how many meanings does the letter in the Quran hatta have in the Arabic language? He said, I don't know. And I said, well, according to Ibn Hisham in Mughni al-Labib, it has 17. And I know 3 or 4 of them. That's it. And so you have to know when Allah says Laylatul Qadr, if you want to know what Laylatul Qadr is, هي حتى مطلع الفجر. هي حتى مطلع الفجر. There it's a harf jar. And what does it mean? Does it mean it is up to and including dawn? Or is it just up to dawn? I mean, which one is it? Because there's different types of hatta. And if you can't answer that question, then you have no authority to be delving into the book and the sunnah without scholars. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَسَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people who know if you don't know. That is an obligation. And taqleed is a negative quality. It's not a positive quality. There's nothing good about taqleed. But if that's where you're at, then that's where you're at. If you can get out of it, good for you. But if you're stuck there, then that's where you're stuck. You're stuck in the mud. And better to be stuck in pure mud than najas mud. Jahal murakkab, that's the last reason, is knowing something incorrectly, which is not knowing it. Exactly, because knowledge is to know something correctly. Al-ilmu yutabiq al-waqi'. It's when it corresponds with reality. If it doesn't, it's not knowledge. And so that's the 6. So those are the 6. All of kufr falls into one of those 6 primary categories. I guarantee you, there's no kufr that you can find that doesn't fall into one of those 6. And the 72 sects are all rooted in those 6. There are 12 permutations for each one of those 6.
May Allah save us from that, inshallah. Inshallah, this session, which is basically open Q&A, will consist of playing catch-up, trying to get some questions answered that we've overlooked thus far throughout the day due to the limitation on time in each individual session. So the topics that will be questioned will range from just about everything discussed today to potentially related topics that were not even directly addressed today. So I'd like to open up this session by posing a question to both panelists, which was offered by several attendees in different forms. I'll read one of them that I thought summarized the essential question the best. This person writes, Considering that historical and sociological context played a part in the formation of theology, what of our current historical and sociological reality could or even should play a role in the way we view or experience creed?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I think that's a really good question. The law changes with regard to the changing of the times. It has to be appropriate for every time. Its fundamental principles don't change, but applications do from one place to another. And theology itself, as it developed in Islamic history, reflects the changing of the times, as Imam Hamza showed in the first lecture. What was sufficient and understood in the first generation was no longer adequate in that form for the fifth generation. And when Greek philosophy and other influences came to play in Islamic society and it became a great civilization, then Islamic faith had to be articulated in such a way that it could be properly understood in that form. And I mentioned at the end of the last period that human knowledge in general, from an Islamic standpoint, should be salvific. It should be a path to salvation. And when we have knowledge in physics or botany or biology that is not properly grounded and that creates great doubts, it creates what some of our great scholars have called knots in the soul. And many of our greatest scholars and greatest men and women have felt that they must remove the knots in the souls. And they must make human knowledge, not just Islamic knowledge, meaningful. And on the basis of that, they integrated all knowledge into an Islamic synthesis. Today, we live in the age of quantum physics. And quantum physics, many of you know much better than I, overturned a lot of the ideas of mathematical certainty and prediction in the material world. There is now a Greek woman who has probably found a solution to the problems of quantum theory. This is just in the last few months, and there was an article about it in Scientific American, which is spectacular. Because Einstein said, and I remember Imam Hamza and I spoke about this in 1998, that there would be a solution to the problems in quantum theory. Einstein was convinced of that because of his own theological beliefs more than his scientific beliefs. But there is now a wonderful philosophy, a wonderful theory about that. And quantum physics, evolution, Big Bang theory, the creation of the universe, the nature of the universe, dark matter. Today we have so much information and so much knowledge and sociological and psychological and social psychological, anthropological theories that it is required of our scholars to understand that and to incorporate it into our theology. This is what the theologians were doing all the time when Islamic civilization was alive. So my answer to that question is that this is an obligation to us, and I believe that in studying what the great scholars of the past did, like al-Baqilani's atomistic theory, and others, that we really have the material with which to work. They built bridges, and it may be that those bridges, because of neglect, no longer span the river. It may be that the river has overflowed its banks, but nevertheless they built, and they built well, and we can learn from that. And I think that we do have an obligation to take this further. And as I said before, this is the supreme knowledge, the knowledge of your Lord. And as we understand it, and even though it may seem very abstruse to some, and we didn't in fact get into the really abstruse parts of it, that it enables you to understand all of the philosophical questions that are presented to you, whatever they are, scientific or metaphysical or whatever. And that is also a supreme obligation of our faith as a universal faith and a faith of civilization.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And largely I agree with everything Dr. Umar said. I would say that one of the downsides of the Sunni community is the total neglect of theology and ethics. I would add ethics to that as well. I mean, there's still some great jurisprudence scholars that we have. I've met Western Christian and Jewish scholars within their tradition that are much more knowledgeable about theology than any of the Muslims that I've met. I mean, there's still Muslims that know the basic texts of the theology, but in terms of really thinking deeply about a lot of the problems that we are confronted with today, because whether we like it or not, we have to deal with the fact that we're living in a world that has introduced ideas. Evolution is a theological problem because it's a problem that deals with cause and effect, and it deals with the origin of our species, and that is where we came from, how we were created and who created us. And it needs to be studied at a very deep level, and then it needs to be looked at. And if it has merits, then those merits need to be identified. And if it has things that are incompatible with our theology, then that needs to be pointed out in a way that can be understood. I mean, one of the things, there's one of the great scholars of the 20th century, Sheikh Muhammad Ramin al-Shinqiti, when the first news of the moon landing came, all these people went to him, scholars, and he was living in Medina at the time. They went to him, and they asked him what he thought, because traditionally, in all the early tafsirs, the moon is in the heavens. وَجَعَلْنَا الْقَمْرَ فِيهِنَّ. We put the moon in the heavens, and the heavens are considered to be blocked, and that Allah prevents anyone from penetrating the heavens without permission, and the Prophet ﷺ was given that permission, and the jinn were prevented even from getting outside and pelted on, according to the Quran. So he was asked about that, and he said there's two possibilities. One, they didn't get there and they're just lying. And two, we've misunderstood the Quran. That was his answer. And that's the answer of a real scholar. And so what happens is, when you get new information that is apparently not consistent with your understanding, either the information is incorrect or your understanding is incorrect. And that needs to be assessed and understood, because we shouldn't end up like these people that think the earth was created 7,000 years ago on October 17th. You know, really, I mean, that because they become the laughing stock of the modern world. Islam has never been the laughing stock of anything. That was always the power of Islam, is that it never shied away from debate and from intelligent discussion. Muslims were never fearful of Christian proselytization, because that's why the Christians could live amongst the Muslims for centuries, and they weren't threatened by them. They never felt threatened by them. And the fact that we even feel threatened by Christian proselytization now in the Muslim world is a sign of the loss of real scholarship and real deep understanding of our tradition. And Dr. Umar gave a talk in California which was called "Stop Where They Stopped and Then Proceed," which is a statement by one of the Shadri scholars. قِفْ حَيْثُ وَقَفُوا ثُمَّ سِرْ. Stop where they stop and then move on. And that's one of the things that we have to do, is we have to first find out where they stop and then move on. But the idea that Mark Twain said the ancients stole all their best ideas from us, and there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, this idea that there's really a lot of new issues is often very false. It's what happens is those old usul al-kufri have different permutations. That's all it is. But you're dealing with some basic fundamental problems. Most of them, in terms of philosophy, all the issues, the basic issues, were dealt with by Plato. He asked all the questions in those writings. And the same is true with theology. I mean, you can't get around dawr wa tasalsul. Those two problems, which are chicken-egg problems and infinite regress problems, you can't get around them. It doesn't matter how sophisticated the jargon becomes, you're still dealing with two essential fundamental problems when you deal with where did all this come from. It's either dawr or tasalsul, or there was a creator, an originator, who's not subject to the laws that this universe are subject to, like entropy and other things.
A couple of people wrote, I'll read two of them, which highlight related questions, and perhaps we can hear from both of the scholars. The first one is, if Iman and Islam are separate, can someone have Iman without Islam? If so, can people with just Iman go to Jannah? On a related note, somebody writes, How about the possibility of having intellect with morality, but without religion? That is, righteousness centered around humanity in a mortal sense, rather than God in an eternal sense.
Iman and Islam are separate and the same. And that's important because Islam is a rubric that encompasses Iman at one level. When we talk about Islam, we're talking about, because our deen is called Islam. And then the deen falls into the three categories of, and really four: Iman, Islam, Ihsan, and then the signs of the end of time, which are the four dimensions. The length, which is the Islam, height, the vertical, horizontal, which is the Iman, and then depth, which is Ihsan, and then time-space, which is the historical inevitability of the end of time. So within the tradition, Islam encompasses all those things. But when we speak about Islam as being the outward manifestation of Iman, then Iman is actually the rubric under which Islam is subsumed. So it depends on which way you're looking at it. Allah says, "Inna deen 'inda Allah al-Islam." He doesn't say al-Iman, but then "Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu," not "Ya ayyuhalladhina aslamu." And at one level, the words are synonymous. Al-Mu'min wal-Muslim. There's a hadith, which is a very powerful hadith for me, because I thought about it quite a bit, which is Al-Muslimu man salima al-Muslimun min lisanihi wa yadihi. The Muslim is the one who Muslims are safe from. But then he says, "Wal-Mu'minu man amina an-nasu min bawa'iqi." But the Mu'min is the one that human beings, humanity, is safe from. So that adds a dimension to Iman, that a Muslim is working at the horizontal level, whereas the Mu'min is on that vertical level, which is a much deeper understanding. And that's why the Quran says, "La taqulu amanna, walakin qulu aslamna." Don't say we believe, but say we're in Islam. وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ. Because Iman has not entered your hearts yet. Lamma has not entered into your hearts yet. So there's an indication that you can be a Muslim and you're not a mu'min. And then when Allah says about the person that was hiding his Iman, He says, قَالَ رَجُلٌ مُؤْمِنٌ مِنْ آلِ فِرْعَوْنَ. He didn't say Muslimun. There was a believing man from Ali Fir'aun who was hiding his Iman. يَكْتُمُ إِيمَانَهُ. He didn't say يَكْتُمُ إِسْلَامَهُ. And so there's an indication that somebody who's in a state of Iman and there's no outward signs of that Iman. And Allah described him as a mu'min. And that's why, there's a proverb the North Africans say, "La tahqiru 'abdan 'asa an yakun lillahi waliya." Don't hold any human being in contempt because he might be a wali of God. Don't assume that you know people's reality. And that's why it is haram to specify the hellfire for any human being. Any human, you cannot say you're going to hell. And there's a hadith that says that the people that say that, Allah will actually forgive the person that He condemns to hell in front of him and tell him to go to hell. And that's a sahih hadith. So it just depends on how you're looking at it. But generally, Islam is the overriding rubric under which Islam, Iman, and Ihsan are covered. So you can look at Islam as the Sharia, and then Iman as the haqiqah of the Sharia, which is your reality of it, and then the Ihsan as the tariqah, the path that those two move along towards their Lord. There's a lot of different ways to look at all of these things. And then if so, can people with just Iman go to Jannah? The definitive verse on that is that Allah will not forgive shirk, and everything other than shirk, He can forgive. You're in the Mashi'ah. You're in the will of God, and it's only shirk. And even this is something a lot of Muslims don't even know. It's not any shirk, it's shirk once you've been given knowledge. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first commandment in the Quran is "I'budu rabbakum," worship your Lord. The first prohibition is وَلَا تَجْعَلُوا لِلَّهِ أَنْدَادًا وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. Don't make idols وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. That's called a jumla haliyah. In other words, your state in making those idols is that you know now that your Lord is one. So the shirk that Allah doesn't forgive is shirk done with knowledge of Allah's unity, once that truth has come to you. So even the mushrik, according to the Ahlusunna Waljama, the dominant opinion is they are actually saved until the truth has come to them and they reject it knowing it's true. Yes. And Imam al-Ghazali, and I think, it's an amazing insight of his. He felt that if Islam came in a distorted manner, that the people were not held to account. And he felt that children that were raised believing that Islam was evil and the Prophet was a Dajjal, that they also would not be held to account. And he was recognizing the sociological reality of filters. Because we know this now, it's very difficult to free yourself from programming of childhood. And also, another really interesting proof for that is in Surah An-Nuh. You see, people, Muslims are all like, Allahumma ahlik al-kafara, Allahumma dammirhum, they go on and on about shattat shamlahum, Allahumma yattim awladuhum, wa armil nisa'ahum. And they make all these du'as against them. Well, there's a hadith, and it's a good hadith, that anyone who curses anything on the earth, that curse goes first to the heavens, and it takes permission from the Lord. The Prophet ﷺ said that the Lord looks at the person from whence the curse emanated, and if he's worthy of the curse, it goes back to him. Which is, that should really make you wary of cursing people. Just that one hadith. So, Nuh, in Surah Nuh, Nuh says, لا تذر على الأرض من الكافرين ديارا. Don't leave on this earth for the kuffar a house. But then he gives the reason why he said that, which is فإنك إن تذرهم يضلون ولا يريدون إلا كافرا إلا فاجرا كفارا. That they, if you leave them, two things happen. One, they will lead your servants astray. Two, they will not give birth except to kuffar. Now, the ulama, Ibn Taymiyyah said an amazing thing. He said, kufr, alladhi la yata'addi, we don't have anything, it's not our business. When people are in a state of kufr where their kufr is not affecting other people, it's between them and God. It's not our business. But what the kufr that we are commanded to oppose is kufr that is leading others astray. Active kufr. You can see it as passive kufr and active kufr. And this is the same if a person's sick and their illness is limited to themselves, then that's between him if he wants to go to a doctor. But when somebody is sick and he can actually pass it on to others, that's why it's a criminal act if you have AIDS and you go out and infect other people. People that have SARS now are quarantined and it's illegal. And if they know that they have it and they go and expose others, they can be why? Because it's active. You're harming other people and you have knowledge of it. The same is true with idlal. So his worry was, if you leave them, they're going to actively lead people astray. But two, there's another reason. They will only give birth to kuffar. Because one of the things why he asked for their destruction is because he gave up hope in them. Because Allah told him that no one, in another surah, Allah told them that those who have believed from your people, لا يؤمن من قومك إلا من قد آمن. None of your people will believe except those who've already believed. So he was given wahi that there was no use anymore, that it was over. And at that point, he realized even their children aren't going to become Muslim. And if you look at the Prophet ﷺ at Ta'if, what he did was he actually forgave the people of Ta'if for what they did. Why? Because he said, "Arju an yakhruja min aslabihim man ya'budu Allah wa la yushriku bihi shay'a." I hope they'll have children. Non-Muslims have children that won't be like them. So because he had hope still, he wouldn't ask for their destruction. He had hope. Whereas Nuh, he lost hope. But then what's Nuh say immediately after he says the dua? وَاغْفِرْ لِي. Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi says he asked forgiveness because he made the dua. So 950 years he called people to Islam, and that's after he made the dua. And people now they make the dua. Why are you making dua against? What did they do? They did this to us and they did that to us. Well, do they know any better? What's the basis for it? I mean, have you really, and really aren't they really a mercy to you? Because have your actions warranted the things that have happened to you? Because our Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا أُمَّتِي أُمَّةٌ مَرْحُومَةٌ. I have ummah that Allah has showered mercy on it. وَجُعِلَ عَذَابُهَا فِي دُنْيَاهَا. And the punishment of this ummah is in this world. So if the veils were lifted, people would see the people that were punishing them as a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because it's dunya punishment, it's not akhirah punishment. And if you get your punishment in the dunya, then you've been shown great mercy. And that's why, it's all veils. People don't see the rahmah of Allah. And one of the things that Imam Nasafi says, he says, once you realize that everything bad that has happened to you, that what you have been forgiven for is much greater than anything you've been afflicted for. He said, once you realize that, all you see is the ihsan of Allah. But he said, when you're veiled from that reality, when all you can see is what harms come to you, because Allah says, whatever ma asabatkum min musiba, famimma kasabat aydikum. Whatever afflicts you is from what your own hands have earned. وَيَعْفُ عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. But He's forgiven much more than He's afflicted you for. But people don't like to think about that stuff because suddenly it just all becomes uncomfortable. Anyway, that was a very long...
That's a really excellent question. Can I add a word
Absolutely.
to it? I'd just like to make 2 points. First of all, I'd like to address the last part of the question. And also I'd like to go back to to what Imam Hamza said about Islam, Iman, Ihsan. It's often helpful to know that in Arabic semantics, you have most what we call synonyms, mutaradifat. They are telescopic, and just like a telescope extends, so it also contracts. So one of the basic principles of Arabic semantics is that there are words like taqwa, bir, udwan, ithm, Islam, iman, ihsan. They say إذا اجتمعت افترقت وإذا افترقت اجتمعت. They are words that if they occur together, they separate. So each one takes on a particular meaning. And if they are used in isolation, then they have the same meanings. They bring all the meanings together. So words like Islam, Iman, Ihsan, used by themselves, they can overlap. It's one of the important rules of the Arabic language. The other part of the question, which was very intriguing, is, if I understood it correctly, is the one about morality and faith. And I'd like to address that. And as I recall from the question, it asks about a person who doesn't believe being moral and a person who believes being immoral. That's how I understood the question. And that's a very important point in itself because of the fact that human beings are created with the fitrah, with pure, natural, primordial disposition. This fitrah is everything that is human. It is belief, knowledge of the oneness of God, knowledge of judgment, knowledge of how to use our hands, how to walk on our feet, how to swallow the baby, how to take the breast of the mother and nurse. That's all fitrah. And part of that fitrah, part of that natural disposition is knowledge of good and evil. So that one of the greatest spiritual joys, spiritual ecstasies, is doing good. All of us get pleasure from good. And we also get great pain from evil. And when we look at the nature of morality and faith, and we look at the nature of immorality and disbelief, we see that the two are so close together, meaning that faith and good morals are so close together, and bad morals and disbelief are so close together that they're almost identical. Our scholars have said that good morality, speaking the truth, being generous, being courageous, being upright, being noble, so forth, forbearing, clement, patient, these are all based on a modest regard for the self, humility, and a high regard for the other. So they are essentially altruistic. And that's the reason why one of the highest states in self-purification in Islam is to overcome your selfishness so that you can become a truly moral human being, so that you can love other people. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother, his human brother or sister, what he loves for himself. This altruism, recognizing the other, recognizing that the other is valuable, as Imam Hamza said, never demeaning the other, never believing you know the reality of the other. This is essential to morality, while having a much lower estimation of yourself. And when we look at faith, faith is almost the same thing, because God is the other. And He is the other with perfection and rights, and the one who has given us everything that we have. So faith and morality are very, very close together. And on the other hand, poor character, which is the aggrandizement of the self and looking down upon others, it's very, very similar to disbelief, which is the rejection of God and of His existence and of His perfection and of His majesty and His beauty and all the good that He has done. So bad character and disbelief, they often go hand in hand. That's why sometimes when we go to certain parts of the world and we see Muslims who have very bad character, then even though we don't say they're disbelievers, we know that there's something wrong. And they are on, or we as well, on the gates of damnation or perdition. These are very close, and a person can be of the highest character and yet not believe, because they're not identical. Yet that person who does have good character is at the gate of faith. They're on the door of paradise. And that's the reason why in the da'wah, in the call, it's always wisest, and it is the way of the Prophet, to look for the best people. And you'll find them in every community, in every social class, among men and women. The people that are generous and courageous, noble, kind, because they already have in them intrinsically all of the essences of belief also. And once they are properly shown, they will enter into the gate of faith. Whereas on the other hand, bad character, it's very difficult to take a person who is in that syndrome and to bring them to faith. I just wanted to make that point. And again, in the Quran, when Allah Ta'ala, when He talks about the enemies of the Prophet, and what does He talk about? Always. Whether it's in a Meccan surah or a Medinan, He talks about their bad character. How they are proud and arrogant, how they repulse the orphan, how they break their word, how they break their covenants. And why? Because of the fact that that is like the illah, the reason for their disbelief. So this connection between good character and faith is really important. And that's why also we always, when we want to measure our faith, we need to always look at our character. If our character is not good, then probably our faith also is not where it ought to be.
Thank you. Dr. Omar, a couple of very quick ones I'm hoping that you could shed some light on. One is with respect to one of the divine names, or I should say one of the names for the divine. Please comment on the Persian word Khuda in the context of the names of Allah.
The word Khuda in Persian, it's a cousin of the word God. And in terms of Indo-European linguistics, because Persian, English, German, Russian, Greek, Latin, Urdu, Pashto, Kurdish, all of these belong to one huge family. Albanian, Bosnian, they all belong to one large family, which is the Indo-European family. And a lot of study has been done on Indo-European, more than Semitic. Semitic studies also, a lot of study has been done on that. And by comparing these languages, we're able to work back to roots. Zoroaster, the great, I believe, prophet of ancient Iran, he was a special type of a priest. He was not a fire priest. He was a priest of supplication. And here the root that is used is the root hotar. And God comes from that root, just as Khuda comes from that root. And they mean he who is supplicated. Zoroaster was a priest of supplication. he called upon God. The word khuda, therefore, is a beautiful word. Our Muslims have used it for 1,400 years. And we should have nothing against that word. When they chose to use it, they knew well what it meant. And it is one of the beautiful words, just like God, just like Deus, these other words. But Deus and those words, they come from a different linguistic background that means light.
Two questions about the Quran. The first one is, if the Quran is uncreated, and therefore outside the realm of creation, is it part of Allah Ta'ala's essence?
This is a good question, and I think it was maybe Brother Sahlul or someone who asked me about the question of speech, that why did the issue of the created nature of the Quran ever become an issue to begin with? The belief of credible historians is that the reason why that became an issue, and in fact this is mentioned in some of the texts, is because of the Christian theology of the Logos, of the Word, the pre-existent Word, and the sonship of Christ, and other issues that pertain to the Trinity. The Mu'tazila, who were rationalists, were also actively involved in the defense of Islam and the propagation of Islam and the conversion of Christians and Jews and Buddhists and others. Their belief was that to say that the speech of God is eternal is essentially the same as the Christians saying that God has an eternal word, which is the Logos that then took on flesh and is His Son and is a God like Him. So this is probably the context for that. Essence is all by itself. Attributes are qualities of the essence. And usually the scholars will say that essence is not attributes, and it is not other than attributes, and attributes are not the essence, and they're not others than essence. In the way that they relate to each other, they're very careful. Speech is an attribute of God, and that's based on revelation primarily, and it's also based on reason. But the basic source of that, as Imam Hamza said, is revelation. That revelation tells us that God speaks and that this is the word of God. وَمَنْ أَصْدَقُ مِنَ اللَّهِ قِيلًا. And who is more truthful than God in speech, in what He says? The Quran itself, as it mirrors that pre-existent speech, then it mirrors that attribute of God. The Quran itself, the book, the Quran that we carry in our pockets and that we read, it is not an attribute of God.
The second question about the Quran is not exactly on point to today's discussion, but I felt it was very important, and I'm sure a lot of people would like to hear this answer. How would you suggest a non-Arabic speaking person prove to themselves that the Quran is God's word?
When I became a Muslim, which was in 1970, the impetus was the life and death of Malcolm X. May God be pleased with him. And Malcolm had a huge effect on me, and I was attracted to his faith. And when I began to read the Quran, I had difficulty with translations. So that essentially what I had to do is to find the translation that I could have some confidence in. And I looked at 3 or 4 before I finally found the Yusuf Ali translation, which was available in the Cornell library. I was in Cornell at that time. And then I took it home and I didn't stop reading it. Yusuf Ali, and this was the old 1936 translation of Yusuf Ali, which is beautiful. And these translations also are really interesting in our modern history. But those of you who've seen this, that you know that he has this running poem. And the running poem probably had as much effect on me as anything else, especially because in it there was the description of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, God bless and keep him, and of his being an orphan and other qualities. And I had not really known what the Prophet was like. And I had heard many things in Sunday school that put me off. I could see that this is a prophet, that this is a prophet like the other prophets. And then as I began to read the Quran, again Yusuf Ali says in his introduction that I know I can't translate the Quran. This is not a translation. I have many shortcomings, but this is the best that I can do. And that was adequate for me. And I know that I didn't understand any of these complexities about Arabic and translation, but to me, I fell in love with the book. And I remember that reading, "Praise be to God, Lord of the world," I memorized that in English, and I prayed with that in English for a long time, maybe a month or 2 months, before I ever found anybody that would teach me that in Arabic. In fact, I didn't know any Muslims or Arabs when I became a Muslim. And I just remember I would think how beautiful this is. And just as Imam Hamza said, the Quran is one of the proofs of God. And to me, all of the problems that I had had with God and faith, from my own Christian background, my own Protestant background, where the Trinity had been the great stumbling block, and other things that pertain to the incarnation of God, they were resolved. And I really felt close to God. And He shows you your signs. So I think the Quran, even in poor translation, and I don't want to say that Yusuf Ali is a poor translation, but it's certainly not adequate. Later on, as the time went by, then I could see that if I didn't learn Arabic and get into the Quran, that I would probably lose my faith.
This has been asked by several people. I think it's a great question that so far I believe was not really discussed or addressed today at all. One of the attributes of God is anger, ghadab. How does this attribute fit into the context of the 13 attributes that we have discussed today? And also, are anger and justice related?
Ghadab is not an attribute of God. Attributes of God are like what we talked about: knowledge, will, power. Ghadab is a function of will and power, as mercy also is a function of will and power.
This completes CD number 5.